6 months from east to west. In the 1830s, north-south traffic in the United States had been relatively developed. However, east-west traffic has always troubled Americans, making the trip from one coast to another very long and hard. At that time, it took 3 to 6 months to travel from New York to San Francisco by horse-drawn carriage, half a year via Cape Horn in South America by boat, and 6 to 9 months by boat through the Panama jungle. Asa Whitney. In 1832, Dr. Hartwell Carver published a paper advocating the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad from Lake Michigan to Oregon. He submitted a proposal to the U.S. Congress in 1847. In 1843, Asa Whitney, a dry goods merchant who was born in Connecticut, USA, sailed on a narrow sailboat. His journey to China took 153 days, his final destination being Guangdong. The slow journey made him miserable, and he began to fantasize. Wouldn't it be beneficial to trade between the East and the West if a railroad could be built from New York to San Francisco, and then there would be a direct ship to China? He thought. These thoughts would be the beginning of his plan. On his way back to the United States in 1844, he drafted a proposal to build the East-West Railway. In 1845, Whitney led a team of 8 to scout the land he wanted the railroad to be built on. Seeking support from entrepreneurs and politicians, he distributed maps and pamphlets and presented plans for the Transcontinental Railroad to the federal parliament. However, when the Civil War broke out in the United States, the plans were put on pause, almost being forgotten due to the very obvious elephant in the room: the Civil War. The Donner Party. In the 1840s, immigration to the West doubled. In the spring of 1846, a total of 87 people, including the 3 families of George Donner, Jacob Donner, and James Reed, the Murphy family from Tennessee, and the German immigrant Keseberg family, departed from Springfield, Illinois, aiming to arrive in California in half a year. To do this, they had to cross the Sierra Nevada before the snow covered the mountains. The migrants reached the Sierra Nevada, but became trapped by an early, heavy snowfall. Nearly half of the members died of freezing or starvation, with some of them resorting to cannibalism to survive. Rescuers from California attempted to reach the migrants, but the first relief party did not arrive until the middle of February 1847, almost 4 months after the wagon train became trapped. Of the 87 members of the party, 48 survived the ordeal. Later, they called this unnamed snow-capped mountain Donner Peak, where many Chinese railway workers were buried 20 years later. Theodore Judah, railroad pioneer and pathfinder. Theodore Judah was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in the year 1826, as the son of a priest. When he was just 12 years old, his father passed away. One of his older brothers went to the West Bank to pan for gold, and another joined the army. At the age of 13, Judah graduated from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the first privately established engineering school in the world. At the age of 20, he became famous for his involvement in the construction of several railway lines, bridges, and canals, including the Troy and Schenectady Railroad and the Niagara Gorge, which were known as modern engineering marvels. In 1854, he met a businessman who had been a colonel in the Mexican-American War. In order to facilitate the transportation of silver mines from the Sierra Nevada, the businessman suggested that Judah build a 51-kilometer Sacramento Valley Railway from Sacramento, California to Folsom. the genius engineer. During the construction of the Sacramento Valley Railroad, Judah came up with a plan to build a 4,000-kilometer Transcontinental Railroad. His enthusiasm earned him the nickname Crazy Judah. In January 1857 in Washington, D.C., Judah published a practical plan for building the Pacific Railroad, in which he outlined the general plan and argued for the need to do a detailed survey of a specifically selected route for the railroad. In September 1859, the first Pacific Railroad Conference was held in San Francisco. Judah was nominated and sent to Washington, D.C. to lobby in general for the Pacific Railroad. He returned to Washington in December and set up an office in the corner of the Capitol Hill building, where he met with President James Buchanan on behalf of the Pacific Railroad Conference and spoke at the federal meeting. In 1860, Judah returned to California and studied several possible routes through the Sierra Nevada. However, on his way back to the East Coast in 1863, he caught yellow fever and died in New York at the age of 37. Lincoln and the Pacific Railroad Act. In 1859, presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln met the railroad engineer Grenville Mellon Dodge in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and he asked, "Dodge, what's the best route for a Pacific Railroad to the west?" During the Civil War, U.S. President Lincoln wanted to put the minerals and soldiers from the west into the eastern battlefield, and in 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act. Central Pacific Railroad. In 1863, then Governor of California, Leland Stanford and his wife Jane Stanford founded the Central Pacific Railroad. 3 other shareholders and an engineer joined. They were Collis P. Huntington, Mark Hopkins Jr., Charles Crocker, and Theodore Judah. On January 8, 1863, Leland Stanford officially broke ground in Sacramento to begin constructing the first transcontinental railroad across the U.S. Stanford hoped to turn California into an area as rich as New York. Transcontinental Railroad participating companies. The first Transcontinental Railroad was mainly contracted by 3 companies. Number 1. The westernmost 200-kilometer section from Oakland to Sacramento was undertaken by the Western Pacific Railroad Company. Number 2. Union Pacific began building railroads westward from Omaha, the conjunction of Nebraska and Iowa. The company is a semi-state-owned enterprise directly supported by the U.S. government. Most of the workers employed were Irish immigrants who were suffering from starvation and disease and left Ireland to seek refuge in America. Number 3. The Central Pacific Company started from Sacramento, California, and built a railway to the east. The 2 companies were expected to meet in 14 years, near Lake Tahoe, on the borders of California and Nevada. Central Pacific built around 600 kilometers of railway on tough terrain under harsh conditions and had to pass through the Sierra Nevada, which is full of cliffs and covered with snow all year round. Union Pacific built more than 2,000 kilometers of railway, with more than half of it crossing plains. Therefore, the construction was much less difficult on the UP side.